the sun, people would get it and they would see it. And if they were human beings, they would be compelled to respond. And this made me even angrier. And then finally that night, when we lit our candles to march for Harvey and George, I had stacks of placards and sacks of magic markers, and I had Harvey Milk's old bullhorn. And I said to people, you've lost a lot more than Harvey. Write down the names of your friends and your lovers who have been killed by this disease. And people were ashamed to do it because the stigma associated with the disease was so horrendous, so overwhelming, that parents would lie about how their children died. And my friends would die and the family would come in and burn the body and sell the furniture and disappear, and there wouldn't even be an obituary, let alone a funeral or memorial service. But that night we began to write the names. And we carried them with our candles down to City Hall. And we left our candles there for Harvey and George. And then we walked another 2 blocks to the Federal Building. And I'd hidden ladders in the shrubbery outside. And I had a nun with a beard on a bicycle distract the police over here. And this way, we climbed up the front gray stone facade of the Federal Building. We had rolls of tape on our wrists, and we covered the whole wall with these placards with the names of our friends and our neighbors and our lovers who had died so horribly and so young. And I looked at that patchwork of names up on the wall. I thought it looks like some kind of weird quilt. I thought of my grandma and my great-grandma back in Bee Ridge, Indiana, and the quilts that they had made out of my great-grandfather's pajamas. I have one on my bed at home now. When I was a little boy, when I was just home sick with the cold or the flu, my mom or my grandma would make a bed for me on the living room sofa and bring out the quilt. And I remember touching the stitches and my mom saying, your great-grandmother made that for you before you were born. That was how much she loved you. She made this for you before you were born. And you have quilts like that in your family, I'm sure many of you. And it was such a perfect symbol of love being passed down through generations, and then the obvious symbolism of fabric of different textures and colors. Just scraps, remnants, but sewn together into something of beauty and great comfort. And so that was the idea. Everybody told me it was the stupidest thing they'd ever heard of. Oh, Cleve, you can't do that. It's too morbid, it's too complicated, it's too expensive. Nobody's going to do that. I've heard that my whole freaking life. And so I beg of you, when you know you've got something in your heart, and you have to do it, and all your friends say that totally sucks and will never work, just do it. So the quilt ended up becoming the world's largest community arts project, and we think of quilting as a particularly American folk art, but in reality there's similar traditions and cultures all over the world. And I've been able to travel all over the world and meet with my brothers and sisters who use the quilt in their own hometowns and communities to fight back against what has become the worst pandemic in the history of our species. I work today mostly in the labor movement. I work for the hotel workers. Right now I'm working on the global boycott against the Hyatt Corporation, which is one of the most brutal exploiters of immigrant women labor in the United States. But whatever I do, I see it as part of the larger movement. And in my mind, there is only one movement, and that is the global movement for peace and for social and economic justice. You have made a commitment to that movement. And I kind of want to thank you for that. But in my life, people are always coming up to me and thanking me for my work, and you don't need to thank me, because I love what I do. There is nothing else in the world that I would rather do. So I'm not going to thank you. I am going to say, though, that I hope you're happy. And I hope that you enjoy what you do, because only if you do will you be able to endure for the long haul. Now, whenever I'm speaking to young people, especially in my own community, I'm always saying, you must demand everything immediately. But that's because I know only if enough of you demand everything immediately is there any hope of getting anything eventually. But some things are worth fighting for a very long time. And when I learned that I was a homosexual, it was a felony. We were imprisoned In my liberal San Francisco, between 2,000 and 3,000 gay men were arrested every year on sex charges, consenting sex between adults. There were special police units in every city whose sole job was to entrap and imprison homosexuals. And now we've got gay couples going to the White House for the Easter egg roll. Now, I am old school, and I admit that had someone told me in 1972 when I joined what was plainly called the Gay Liberation Front, that 40 years later I'd be campaigning for the right to join the army and get married, you know, I probably would have tried dating women. But this current push for marriage equality means a lot to me. I personally have no desire to be married. I couldn't care less what the state thought about my relationship. But this focus on marriage equality has its roots in the AIDS pandemic, when we cared for our lovers and we cared for our friends. And we were there day after day as they died, emptying the bedpans, putting in the IV, counting the pills. And after that, how dare you say that's not a family? How dare you say that's not a marriage? So I don't make fun of the marriage advocates. And on March 25th and 26th and 27th, my friends and I all over the country are going to be holding vigils and rallies as the Supreme Court hears the oral arguments on the two cases, one against Prop 8 and one against the Defense of Marriage Act. Now, I want to say one more thing and then I'll shut up. So the rhetoric out of the last International AIDS Conference was about an AIDS-free generation. And I do believe that we're very close to a time when there will no longer be any babies born with HIV. It is outrageous that that continues. It's not happening in our country because we have money. That's the only reason it's not happening in this country. We have money and we have the means to test people, and we have enough legal protections for HIV-positive people that women are willing to be tested before they give birth. And we know that a handful of pills called nevirapine at a cost of about $1.20, administered to the mother and the baby after she's born, provided the mother has access to clean water for formula and doesn't have to breastfeed, the baby's not going to get AIDS. But there's still all the millions and millions and millions of people who are already infected. And how does that work? And so the babies that are born without HIV, by the time they turn 16, how many of them will be infected? And there is no progress yet that I'm aware of for a vaccine or a cure, but there is a way forward. Recent studies in the last 2 years have confirmed what many of us have speculated about for years, that people like me who are being successfully treated for HIV, successfully being defined as being undetectable. I have an undetectable viral load for 7 years now. And now it's been proven that people who are successfully treated can transmit the virus to their sexual partners. So the way forward is to remove every remaining obstacle to treatment. Now, there's a lot of obstacles, and you're all smart people and you're involved, so you know what those obstacles are. They're economic, they're political, they're religious, but the greatest of all is the social stigma that is still attached to this disease. So, in your work, in your campaigning, you are really going to make a difference. And there is a potential for each one of you to take credit for saving an awful lot of lives. But probably the single most important part of that is you taking your personal responsibility for addressing that issue of stigma. And the message of the quilt was very simple, but it was really more radical than we had even known at the time when we were starting to sew it together. It had a profoundly radical message. It said, all these lives have value. All these lives have worth. And we will fight for every one of them. That's what you're doing. So I do thank you. Questions?